what I have come to learn is this is way more than fracking. And there is fracking, but it's part of a bigger picture. And it's a picture that's being propped up by, among other things, our government. So with that said, buckle up and I will start to describe what's going on. This is my opinion, and I hope by the end of my presentation, you guys will agree with me that the Southern Tier Solutions proposal is an example of the nationwide feeding frenzy for federal tax credits and incentives that are designed to prop up the fossil fuel industry. It's a dangerous, destructive, unsustainable experiment consisting a grab bag of costly false solutions that will perpetuate our reliance on fossil fuels while diverting investment and human resources from the real solutions that we need for our energy transition. Oh, I didn't want to put that slide in, sorry. So what's happening? Back in October, 6,500 landowners in Chemung, Broome, and Tioga County received a brochure in the mail, or a letter really in the mail, from Southern Tier CO2 to Clean Energy Solutions, offering to provide them with an environmentally and economically compatible solution for cooperatively capturing and sequestering carbon dioxide while generating clean and reliable energy from shale gas resources of New York's Southern Tier. So they way overdosed on alliteration, but that's what they're selling, by a guy named Bryce Phillips, who is the president of this company. And I've put the link in the chat if you want to go read more about it. They actually have quite a lot of information on their website. The FAQ section is astonishingly comprehensive. It may not all be true, but there's more Q&A and information there than I'm used to seeing from oil and gas folks. It's really a lot of information. Oh, why is this? So what are they proposing? They're proposing to begin with a series of pilot wells across the Southern Tier in predominantly these three counties. And they're proposing an alternative to what we know of as high volume hydraulic fracturing. Instead, they want to inject CO2 without water or chemicals or proppants and at lower pressures than what are typically done, or that what we know of as being done with high volume fracking. They would recover methane while storing the CO2 that they inject in the shale pockets. So in other words, the methane would displace the CO2 would come out, or sorry, the CO2 would displace the methane, so that the CO2 stays in the pockets and the methane comes out. It's a process known as carbon sequestration with enhanced gas recovery. It's been done for years for oil recovery, enhanced oil recovery, but the idea of using it for gas recovery is new. And then they would sell the gas to utilities or private industry, but what they're really most interested in is using the gas to fuel a new zero emission power plant that uses something called the alum cycle, and I'll get into that. They say that power generation would support New York's need for long duration emission-free power, and that they would then capture the CO2 from that power generation, use it to frack and recover more methane gas for more alum cycle power plants, and then also use that power for powering something else called direct air capture of CO2. When the power that they make isn't needed to support the grid. They'll capture CO2 directly from the air, and recover more methane and put that into a pipeline and feed that into more fracking. And so, on and on the cycle goes, using more and more fossil fuels and burying the waste in our ground. They said, yeah, they might also make hydrogen from the methane, but right now it's not part of their financial model. So here's what this looks like, and we'll be referring to this diagram from time to time throughout. I'll integrate it in. You don't have to memorize it. But it starts out at about 11 o'clock here with high pressure CO2 pipelines, and they capture the CO2 from industry, usually power plants or other heavy industrial users, inject that CO2 into pipelines that then would get brought into New York State to drill and inject into our shale, recover the methane, then feed the methane into the power plant that would then be able to supply power to the grid, would also provide power for these direct air capture things. The CO2 captured from the plant and the CO2 captured from direct air capture would get put into pipelines, and around we go. So that's what's being proposed. And probably have some questions like, why here? So this is a map that may look familiar, but we haven't seen it in a while. This is a map of the Marcellus and Utica shale formations. This darker green is the Marcellus is on top, and the Utica shale is underneath. Where there's just Utica shale and not Marcellus, it's in blue. And where there's just Marcellus and not Utica, it's in this lighter green. But mostly in New York, in this southern tier, and certainly in a lot of Pennsylvania, there's both Marcellus layer on top and the Utica shale underneath. So they recognize that there's a large expanse of rural lands over these methane-rich formations. What they like about New York as compared to Pennsylvania is that we have fewer existing well bores. So there's less risk of the CO2 leaking out. We have no prior fracking, hence more methane reserves remain. Also, the water from fracking interferes with the recovery of the methane. They further say that because our state has a mandate for 100% carbon-free generation and few viable options for long duration generation, and I'll get into that in a little while, that this becomes viable from the standpoint of the Allen Power Plant as well. They've looked at maps, and the EPA says that we've got more than 7 million tons of CO2 emissions annually within a 15-mile radius of Binghamton. So they're picturing those CO2 emissions could be captured. And then also there's a large network of existing gas pipelines in Pennsylvania that lead into New York, and that these can be a right-of-way for CO2 pipelines as well. So here's a map of these three counties and just a little bit of a overview. First thing to note is while they think there's not a lot of wells, these little dots that you see everywhere are wells. The blue ones are active, the sort of teal color are active wells. So Chemung County has clearly far more wells than Tioga or Broome. The colors here, some of you may remember that the Marcellus shale, as it moves further north, becomes thinner and closer to the surface. And so this color gradient, and I don't have the exact numbers of what the actual thickness is, but it's thinner to the west and thicker to the east. So from looking at this, both from the standpoint of not a lot of wells and also a thicker layer of Marcellus shale. It would seem to me that they would especially be interested in Broome County. These orange squares, or not squares, but orange irregularly shaped areas, are mapped as disadvantaged communities, and the areas with the cross hatches are considered environmental justice communities. I honestly, I did not look up the technical difference between the two, but just know that, you know, that they have populations that are vulnerable and already overburdened by emissions. So, you know, our laws and hopefully our conscience doesn't allow us to further pollute those areas. The pink lines are rail lines throughout that, you know, come from Pennsylvania. I should also, by the way, just thank Karen Edelstein from Frack Tracker Alliance for these maps. She's been doing a beautiful job pulling together pretty much whatever stuff I ask for. She's just amazing. So anyhow, the pink lines are rail lines, and these blue lines are pipelines. The pink dots are injection points. So that would be a place that methane could be injected into the system. So that's just a little bit of a pictorial version of why this is being proposed here. Next question is why now? And there's a very not pretty history of this. Back in 2008, in the Obama administration, they authorized an IRS section called 45Q that gave tax credits for carbon capture and sequestration, or storage, some people call it. And then there's also CCUS, which means utilization. And the difference is storage or sequestration is just straight up putting the CO2 that you've caught into the ground. CCUS, the utilization, is for what I've talked about or named briefly, which is the enhanced oil recovery. That's predominantly the way that captured CO2 is being used right now in this country. And the tax credit allowed $20 per metric ton for just straight up storage, and $10 per metric ton if you used it for oil recovery. It's expensive to build these sort of units, and there wasn't much industry interest. Under Trump, that changed. He increased the tax credit over time from 20 up to 50 for storage, and up to 30 per metric ton for utilization and storage. And then here's the real kicker. There's no federal spending cap for the amount of tax credits that are issued. So, you know, this is a real giveaway, a real huge subsidy that we end up paying for either in our taxes or in the deficit that this country runs up. Biden, I hope it was largely thanks to Manchin, but in the 2021 Inflation Reduction Act, he increased the tax credits, and in the Infrastructure Investment and Job Act, he allowed $12.2 billion for infrastructure related to carbon capture. Oh, that should be CCS, not CCA, sorry. So what have the tax incentives gone to now? Or I should say tax credits. They're not just incentives. They are credits, which means you get to deduct that whole amount off of your tax bill, up now to $85 per metric ton for sequestration, $60 per metric ton for enhanced oil or gas recovery. Direct air capture, sucking, using fans to pull the CO2 directly out of the air, gets $180 a ton for sequestration and 130 for enhanced gas or oil recovery. Here's another real sweet spot for industry. If there's no tax liability, if the company doesn't have enough tax liability, then they get direct payout for the expenditures. And the requirement is that they start construction by 2026, and 12 years of credits are allowed right now, but everybody's already anticipating that those will be extended. And the EPA has now started to, or will be imposing fines on industries that don't capture and dispose of their emissions or otherwise reduce them. So it's no wonder, in light of this, that the Southern Tier Solutions group on their website says that they have an aggressive pace of development, that they need to capture a significant number of leases and a significant number of wells being drilled. The greatest obstacle they face is running out of time, and of course, because they've got to start construction by 2026. At least as things stand right now, and who knows if that timeline will be extended. It already has been once. Whoops. So back to the diagram again. We can now see a bit more of their business model and all of the ways that they can earn money by capturing the carbon and or selling the methane. So here and here, here they're selling power to the grid. Here they can sell the methane that they recover direct to industry, but they get a lot. And in fact, they say that they will get more for storing the carbon than they will for selling the methane. The Alum Cycle Power Plant is being funded by DOE, along with as part of the Infrastructure Act, along with the tax credits. Direct air capture, same thing. There's money available to build, and then there's also tax credits for the CO2 that you capture. So this is just a real boondoggle for industry. And they've got this crazy, I mean, just mind-bogglingly crazy vision. They envision building a dozen or more what they're calling hubs across our southern tier. Each hub would have a bunch of land, and each hub will have its own 300 megawatt alum power plant. 300 megawatts, just to put that in perspective, is what the Cayuga power plant generated. So they want to have a dozen of those. And all of the pipelines and CO2 storage and the separation units to separate the flow back of CO2 and methane. They say that they're going to use battery electric powered drilling equipment and battery powered trucks, and that they're going to have all of their pipes and gathering lines and networks of both CO2 and methane gas, and distribution lines all subsurface. And they want 12 of these. And they say that this method that they're using of not using water, that this is not yet being done here. It's only being done in China. And they say that here in the US, companies haven't been forced to choose between CO2 and water. Water is obviously the common thing now for fracking, but they predict that water-based fracking will no longer be, they use the word available, I think they meant desirable, following the results of, they're calling this their pilot program here in the southern tier. And then this is just like this mind-blowing statement. Together we shall develop and deliver the blueprint to this nation and the free world. So, some days I just kind of wonder, what are they smoking? And other days I think, oh my God, this is really, if even if their project doesn't get off the ground, this is how industry is starting to think, and it's staggering to think of industrializing our southern tier this way. Oh, there he is. So I apologize that I'm not going to have anywhere near the humor, but it is time to take a closer look at what's being proposed. And starting with these 45Q tax credits, which really, when you learn the things that I've learned, it's just nothing but a money fountain to the industry. It's unbelievable. First of all, these tax credits are confidential because they're part of the company's tax filing. So we're never going to know which companies are getting how much money for these projects. And if multiple companies are invested in the equipment, if one has the heat exchanger and another one has the CO2 filter and another has the, whatever, the CO2 separator, all of them can claim credit for the project. Further, they self-report their emissions and their disposal paths, whether they're doing storage or enhanced oil or gas recovery. They report that to the EPA. They also report it to the IRS, but there's no manifest. With hazardous waste, there's from point of origin to point of disposal, every truck driver, every mile covered in this country is known what happened to every ounce of hazardous waste. Here, there's no manifest, and there's no coordination between the EPA and the IRS to ensure that even just the basic numbers match. Furthermore, EPA doesn't verify the emissions nor monitor at all the disposal or storage. And in fact, there's no mechanism to monitor the fugitive CO2 emissions after storage. So this is just a staggering billions and hundreds of billions in tax credits to give away to polluters over the next 12 years. So I want to start dialing in now to talk about, even before we talk about the high pressure pipelines, to talk about the CO2 that's captured from industry and how that gets done, because that's a big part of what's being promoted now. They capture industrial CO2 emissions from fossil fuel power plants, refineries, and heavy industry. Hundreds of millions of dollars have been funded to do this, and there are very few, literally just a handful, because they're very difficult to build and quickly become uneconomic. And they consume a lot of energy to run them. What's more is they're not fully effective. They capture only about 40 to 60% of the CO2 emissions, and they don't do anything to capture the nitrous or sulfuric emissions that, of course, also harm the communities that live in the shadows of these big emitters, most of whom are located in environmental, the plants are located in environmental justice communities. So what's happening through these tax credits that are promoting carbon capture is that these plants will keep operating, keep polluting, people will remain impacted, and now they get tax credits and other funding to do this nonsense. It's a totally false solution. What's more, there's hard evidence written, just like they found documentation that industry knew that CO2 causes global warming. There is documentation that shows that the oil and gas industry knows that this is not a real solution, but They like it because it allows them to keep operating and pretend that they're fixing the problem, which is, the guts of what greenwashing is. And this just sort of shows how much our government is wedded to this approach. Kerry at COP28, just, in the past week, said the bottom line is that this COP needs to be committed to phasing out all unabated fossil fuels. Unabated means that they're not doing carbon capture. So, what we know, we need to be committed to phasing out fossil fuels, period. But that's not yet where our government is at. And it's just gut-wrenching to think that. So now we'll get into talking about transporting the CO2 in pipelines. And there, getting a little bit into some of the physics that I can't fully explain to you. CO2 is transported in pipelines in a phase called supercritical. And so if you look at this picture on the left, we're familiar with, the phase of gas and liquid and even, dry ice as solid CO2. But there's also, if you reach 88 degrees Fahrenheit and a bit over 1,000 pounds per square inch, you convert this CO2 into a new phase of matter called a supercritical fluid that combines behaviors of gas and liquid so that it flows like a liquid, but it diffuses into spaces like a gas. And of course, there's energy required to pressurize it and heat it. And this must be maintained during transport and storage. So let's talk about the regulation, or really lack thereof, for CO2 transport by pipelines. I'll let you know that we have right now over 5,000 miles of CO2 pipelines. Mostly they're in the oil fields, but the U.S. is looking for, again, massive build out and lots of funding to build these pipelines. They will be regulated by several agencies. The Pipeline Hazardous Materials and Safety Authority, the Army Corps of Engineers for when they cross water bodies, HUD for when they are located within some proximity to public housing, and then the states also have authority for smaller pipelines. Since January of 2021, the DOE has announced over $400 million in project investments that advance the research, development, and deployment of carbon transport and storage approaches. So, we're building this stuff, but where are we at with regulating it? There's currently standards for CO2 pipelines are based on oil and gas pipelines. But it behaves very differently, especially in its supercritical state. CO2 is an asphyxiant. It's heavier than air, and in our ambient air, it's in very low concentrations. When these pipes rupture, and people start breathing higher concentrations of CO2, right? That's what our body is always breathing out and getting rid of. Now, if you're getting more CO2 in than you're getting oxygen, you suffocate. And also what happens, and this was discovered, I'll have a little excerpt in the next slide of this emergency in Mississippi where a pipeline did rupture, is guess what? All of our internal combustion engines conk out when they don't get oxygen to burn. And that led to people who were falling down, seizuring, suffocating, passing out, and emergency vehicles were not able to get to them. CO2 pipelines in this high pressure situation are susceptible to zipper-like fractures that can run down a significant length of the pipe, release immense amounts of CO2, hurl large sections of pipe, expel pipe shrapnel, and generate enormous craters. And yet they're being regulated as if it's a pipe containing oil. Water, which is very difficult to eliminate from pipelines, forms carbonic acid, which is very corrosive to pipelines. And further, there's no standards to monitor or control the CO2 content that leaks into the system. And last, CO2 is not odorized to enable leak detection the way we have with gas, methane gas, which also is odorless until they add that stinky stuff to it. CO2 pipelines are the sewage system for the fossil fuel industry, funded by us, the public, and without any public protections. So I mentioned this already, that massive CO2 pipeline expansion is planned through lots of money. I'm gonna, oh geez, I have to just change a setting on here, I think, for you to be able to hear the video. Let me just see. Okay, oops. Back up a page. And here's I'll just play a short excerpt of the pipeline rupture in Mississippi for you to hear and see. What you'll see is just a model impact. It's not an actual pipeline rupture.
Fish to have a nice time, and we were on our way back, and yeah, around about 7 o'clock, I saw a big explosion. I was there when it happened. It actually just boom, big cloud of smoke went up in the went up in the air, and I called my mother immediately, and I told her, I said, "Mama, this pipeline that blew up down here, we on our way to come get y'all." And by the time we turned on Prairie Creek Road off number 3, the car just shut off and went dead. And my cousin, which is Victor Lewis, he was.
And welcome to my world without
Lewis, he was driving
broadband.
at the time. He said, "Cuz, the car cut off." As soon as he said that, that was it. We woke up at the hospital.
So you passed out at that point?
Yes.
Okay. Now,
Fish to have a nice time, and we were on our way back around about 7 o'clock.
Let's now start. Okay. Hopefully we're getting back to the slideshow now. So that's.
And yeah, around about 7 o'clock.
Hang on, let me.
I saw a big explosion. I was.
Sorry, guys. So that's what we have to look forward to with CO2 pipelines. So STS has talked of ways of getting CO2 here to start their fracking process. At one point they talked about bringing CO2 in by rail from the Gulf and then trucking it to the injection site. They've also more recently at a different presentation talked about capturing CO2 from power plants in Pennsylvania, Karen Edelstein has mapped and found that there are over 7,000 fracking wells in the northern tier of Pennsylvania that they could also capture CO2 from. So it's a little unclear what they're going to do, and I don't think they fully know. But anyhow, I found a report from 2020 from the Federal Railroad Authority that said that the fleet of cars available to transport CO2 is 1,300 cars. This is back in 2020. And that they were all already occupied, that the fleet was captive. New cars back then would cost 200 to 225,000 per piece. But lucky us, in September 15th of this year, our DOE announced $27 million for carbon dioxide transport networks to manage the emissions. So now we're going to move to the next stage. They're transporting the CO2 here somewheres from industrial sites where they're leaving a lot of CO2 and other pollutants behind, but pretending it's working. And now they're going to come and drill and inject CO2 into the shale and recover methane. So what does that look like? So, as I've mentioned, there's been a long tradition of enhanced oil recovery using CO2 even before 45Q. Enhanced gas recovery is newer. They inject supercritical CO2 into the wells, which act as a solvent to release more oil or gas. I'm not Tony Ingraffia, in case you guys haven't noticed. So this is a very superficial understanding of what goes on, and I hope at some point Tony and I will be able to collaborate and get to a much better understanding. But in any
Irene, what is supercritical CO2?
That's what I described a couple of slides ago. It's that new phase of matter that's at a higher pressure and a higher temperature, and it takes on properties of both liquid and gas.
Okay, yeah, so it's also one of the things that Dave Bradley's referring to in chat. Okay, I got it.
Okay. So they drill a vertical well and then turn the corner, as I call it, using the methods that we've heard of before, right? And heard of with fracking. And then they drill horizontally. So they drill, they inject around the casing, they put in some sort of drilling cement. But apparently they now have this method. I don't know if you guys remember from the fracking days that they would inject and then do this sort of explosive thing underground, and you'd get a huge flow back. Initially you got a lot of the fluid back, but then you started getting a sizable volume of gas back, but it tapered off very quickly. They're now using a method, at least with this CO2 fracking, and most of the CO2 fracking again is done for oil, and it's usually done using water along with the CO2. So they use this method they call huff and puff, which from what I can gather is they drill, somewhat of a distance, push in the CO2, and then the CO2 is enough of a solvent that it somehow works its way into the fissures and on its own without creating new ones, but just finds the natural pathways and is supposedly more soluble in the shale, or somehow works its way in and displaces the methane, and the methane comes out. And then so they get more, it's a little bit of a slower, instead of this huge geyser of gas coming out initially, but it's a more of a slow and steady. And then as they see it start to taper down a little bit, then they drill a little further and inject more supercritical CO2. And again, STS proposes no water, chemicals, or proppants. It's a new method that they say is only being used in China, but of course is going to become, the wake up call for the entire free world as they have it. And it seems like, at least, in the diagrams that I found that I could understand, that there's a separate production well, so that there's one well that you inject the stuff in from, and another well that you use to suck the methane out from. And I haven't confirmed this with anybody. It's, but it is what I found in this diagram that I grabbed. So here's what STS claims about methane recovery. And then on the right-hand column are my opinions about what they're saying. And you'll see that there's a lot that we still don't know, and certainly that I don't know. Some of you guys, I know Dave Bradley's on, he gets in the weeds way more than I do, and I don't know who else is on, but some of you guys may have answers. But anyhow, STS says that they're going to use electric trucks and drilling equipment, and I call that a greenwashing Pinocchio right there, because I don't know how they're going to do that out in the middle of rural areas of Tioga and Broome and Chemung counties. There just isn't that kind of power supply anywhere near the 1,000-acre parcels that they want to, set up for doing this drilling. So I don't, they're going to have to tie into power lines, or I don't know how they're going to do it. I mean, there's how many farm fields do you drive by where you can't even see any electricity going by? Then they say they're going to inject CO2 at a lower pressure than high volume fracking. I don't know if keeping it at a supercritical state. Honestly, I don't know how they keep it at a supercritical state once they inject it. And Tony questioned that too. But they claim that they're injecting at a lower pressure than high volume fracking. That needs to be fact checked, which I've been indicating in this chart with an FC. And then the slash is because there's two statements in a lot of these. So they'll inject lower pressure, that we can fact check. No earthquakes, no leaks. I think the no earthquakes is to be determined. There certainly have been earthquakes in other places where CO2 has been injected. They're saying that because it's so much lower pressure that there won't be. And then they're saying no leaks, and I'm calling BS on that. And I think you all know why, but I'll have a slide about that in a minute. They say that CO2 dissolves the calcite in natural shale fracture networks. So fact checked, is that true? And that it doesn't damage shale in the same manner as high volume fracking. My question, that seems like careful language, does it damage it in some other way? They claim that only 12 to 18% of methane is recovered with high volume fracking, and that CO2 provides a higher yield. I think the first part can be fact checked and the second part is to be determined. They say that shale absorbs CO2 and releases CO4. I believe, I've seen enough in the literature to believe that at least is true. But that 2 to 3 times more CO2 is absorbed than methane is produced. Fact check that. I don't know if that's right. Here's something that was, more staggering to me than pretty much anything else that I've said to you, which should tell you something. They say in their literature that Marcellus shale has and that's the whole extent of it, not just the New York portion, that the Marcellus shale has the capacity to sequester 165 billion tons of CO2. And that equals 20 plus years of CO2 output of the entire US. Which makes me realize that their real plan is probably not about harvesting the methane. That's sort of a bonus byproduct It's really about sequestering CO2 because that's where the real money is. So we can fact check whether they have their math right. I don't know where they get this 160 billion tons of CO2. But I do wonder what's the New York capacity. And remember, there's also the Utica shale underneath the Marcellus. And they have in their FAQs on their website talked about they'll start with Marcellus and then, you know, potentially go to the Utica as well. They foresee this set of projects that they're proposing for the next 30 to 50 years. And they've been telling landowners at their meetings that the landowners will earn more money from the CO2 sequestration than from the methane production. So really, I think the plan, and this just, you know, I don't have words, is to look at New York State as a potential garbage dump for CO2 waste, potentially from around the country. So, you know, their nonsense about that it's not going to leak. Well, we know, thanks to Tony, that all wells leak eventually, and 7% at least of the conventionally fracked wells in Pennsylvania leaked immediately. There's a lot of pathways for gas migration, and those are diagrammed in this diagram. Basically they happen around the cement. So this annular thing is the well casing, and then this gray speckly stuff is the cement. It's not cement like our sidewalks are made of. It's some different kind of compound that theoretically forms a seal between the well casing and the ground, the soil and rock formations that are drilled through. But those seals can break down over time. It can break down at the juncture of the pipeline and the cement. It can break down if the well is plugged. And I forgot to tell you in that diagram way earlier from Karen Edelstein, there are wells in there that were little dots with an X in those. Those are wells that have been plugged. So we have a lot of wells that have been plugged, and the seal between the cement and the plug in the casing can also break down. Then there can be fissures in the cement itself. There can be a break in the casing. There can be, you know, breaks in the cement. In other words, lots of ways. Some other things.
Irene, plus the production of concrete generates all kind of greenhouse.
Yeah, this is a different concrete. This is not cement like concrete cement. This is different stuff.
But I'm assuming that it's going to generate greenhouse gas emissions because it's a manufacturing process.
Yeah, you're probably right about that, but just to be clear, it's different than the concrete.
Yeah, I got
yeah,
that.
Yeah. Some other things to note: CO2 plus water gives carbonic acid, which can react chemically, dissolving rock and cement, leaching heavy metals into groundwater. Fissures or abandoned wells, and we saw many of those, offer pathways for leakage. Carbon dioxide waste could potentially acidify and permeate groundwater, poisoning the drinking water. Increased risk for earthquakes could also compromise the seal integrity. And actually there was a ground shift that happened in that Mississippi pipeline that ruptured, was caused by a ground shift. So not unheard of, and probably especially when you're doing all kinds of weird fracking in the area too. And again, companies that claim the 45Q tax credits do not need to ensure that the CO2 stays in the ground. So what the hell are we doing? I mean, seriously, we are pretending to fix the climate crisis by doing this, and none of it is really proven technology. So now I want to shift gears, and for those of you keeping track, we're now at the bottom of my circle of the diagram, to where we take the methane that's been captured and feed it to an alum cycle power plant. And in a nutshell, it generates power, it recycles the CO2 in actually kind of interesting ways. So I have a little video to explain to you how an alum cycle gas power plant works and is different than a typical power plant that we have today. So here we go.
Hi, Rich Powell from ClearPath. Today, we wanted to share a bit about a technology we've been tracking closely. Once it is deployed at commercial scale, it will change everything about the way clean energy is produced in the United States and around the world. The technology is called net power, and it cleanly uses fossil fuel to generate electricity and capture all of its carbon, so it operates with zero emissions. To understand why net power is so exciting, you first have to understand how a normal gas power plant works and how traditionally we've done stuff to those plants to take out all of the carbon dioxide. First, a little about normal gas power generation. It all starts with a combustor, where you combine natural gas with air, light it on fire, and produce a bunch of hot gas. With a lot of water, a heat exchanger generates steam, which turns the turbine, generates electricity, and goes out onto the grid to our cities and millions of our own homes. You then have all that exhaust to deal with. It has to go through scrubbers, get rid of all the traditional pollutants, and then a bunch of CO2 and air is left at the end. If you care about that CO2 and capturing it, you have to install a bunch of other new gear. You'll need a scrubber and a compressor to crush it all down into a pipeline and send it to somewhere where it can be used or where it can be safely and permanently stored. That CO2 scrubber and additional gear is expensive, and it takes much of the electricity from the turbine to run the whole system. Net Power's technology is much simpler. Instead of burning gas with air, it is burned with pure oxygen. This is more efficient and doesn't produce other pollutants that are bad for the environment, only CO2 and water. So the ultra-hot CO2 goes out, that's what turns the turbine, not steam, and out of the turbine, a lot of that CO2 is actually recycled back into the combustor. A little bit of CO2 is left over, but it's already pure and at very high pressure, so it's pipeline ready. If you're keeping track, that's zero carbon emissions, zero air pollutants, and zero water required. Now, it does require a lot of pure oxygen, so one piece of equipment called an air separation unit is needed. That requires using some electricity, but overall so much simpler than a traditional power plant. And because of that, the whole thing may only cost about as much as an existing gas plant to set up and run. And that would mean we'd have all the benefits of the gas plant: low cost, high flexibility, availability, and dispatchability. In an exciting development at the end of 2021, the Net Power test facility in La Porte, Texas, synchronized with the grid, a major milestone toward delivering emissions-free electricity to homes and businesses for the first time ever with this type of technology. The company is now focusing on commercialization and global deployment, recently teaming up with energy technology giant Baker Hughes to design and manufacture critical turbo machinery for Net Power plants. If you're not an engineer, yes, turbo machinery basically means really efficient and really reliable. And the exciting part, the first commercial scale Net Power plant could be powering the grid as early as 2026. This technology could change everything about the way we generate clean energy in the United States. Thanks for listening.
Let me get to the next slide here. Back to slideshow. So first thing to know is that the Department of Energy is putting a lot of money into alum cycle power plants and a related thing called Brayton cycle. which is a different kind of system to do the carbon capture on existing power plants, but it is not nearly as efficient as these alum cycles. So the alum cycle power plants are considered a game changer. But as noted in the video, there's just one operating right now. It's 50 megawatts. There's a 300 megawatt also being planned in Texas that I think the completion date is projected to be 2026. So it's not yet under construction. I think plans are getting finalized sometime in 2024. Why might New York be interested in this sort of thing? Is because our CLCPA, the Climate Act, requires 100% emission-free generation by 2040. And we have these things called, long duration intermittencies, where it's possible that for 7 to 14 days, oftentimes in winter, there's not enough sun or wind to meet our energy needs. So this diagram on the right is a diagram of what our New York State independent system operator, the folks who run the grid in New York, are envisioning for how we're going to meet our energy needs by 2040. And we'll just stick with the outer circle here for the sake of time. The outer circle, 62% of our resources will come from renewables. But as you'll note, those are intermittent. So it's sun, solar, wind, land-based offshore wind, large-scale solar, and behind-the-meter solar. Another 23% comes from what are referred to as our baseload resources, which are nukes and hydro and imported power. 5% comes from battery electric storage. But the thing about battery electric storage, at least as the technology exists right now, is that the batteries discharge over about 4 hours, is about as long of a duration of power that you can get from battery storage right now. So the question is, and honestly, New York State doesn't have an answer for this, is what do we do for this 10% of the time where we need dispatchable, meaning we can turn it on when we need it, emission-free energy. And so Southern Tier Solutions is suggesting that the alum cycle power plant could be something that meets the needs of the state here. And I have to admit that they're right. Is it the only type of dispatchable resource? No. Is it better than others or not? I'm not well versed enough to say. Some people are looking at hydrogen storage, but as we know from Bob Howarth's work, making hydrogen often is fossil fuel intensive, and it's certainly energy intensive. And do we really want to be using our renewable energy resources to make and store hydrogen? And there are, some potential other solutions that are being explored, but they are all in early stages, as is the Allen Power Plant. And none of them are scalable yet. So it's not clear how we're going to meet this energy need and whether New York might support the alum cycle plant as a solution. So now I want to turn to another use of the power from the power plant when it's not needed to feed the grid. What STS's proposal looks at is doing something called direct air capture. So direct air capture, and the only way to describe it is the epitome of energy and efficiency. CO2 in our ambient air is only 0.04% of the contents of the air. And the idea is to run these enormous fans that will capture CO2 in a filter. You then have to heat the filter to remove the CO2, and then heat and compress it to turn it into the supercritical state to put it into a pipeline for transport. And it literally takes more energy to run than the CO2 that's removed. It's just insanity. And in addition, for those who have, been following stuff with cryptocurrency also uses giant fans in their instance to cool off the computer processing machines that are, doing the stupid stuff for cryptocurrency. They're enormously noisy as well. It sounds like jet engines that just run 24/7. So, that would not be popular either. So this is sort of my summary slide of what we're actually looking at. Habitat destruction, compressors, leaks, ruptures, explosions, and asphyxiation from CO2 pipelines, leaks of CO2 and methane, heavy metals potentially contaminating groundwater, possible earthquakes, energy needed. Every time you see one of these little, hazard with a lightning bolt, it's to indicate that there's energy input needed. So separations and compressors and leaking methane and CO2. Oh, I didn't mention, remember that the gas that we get from fracking is radioactive, as are the drill cuttings that would have to be disposed of. The power plants, 300 megawatts, they want to build a dozen of them here in the southern tier. That's going to take a whole lot of power lines that don't exist. Again, if you've driven up by Cayuga power plant, you know that there's a ton of power lines that come out of there. That's going to be a hell of a lot of transmission lines, and not clear how that's going to get paid for. The direct air capture brings us noise and very energy intensive. And around we go, and we're none of it doing anything to stop the use of fossil fuels. So overall, I have to tell you guys, this mad scientist doing experiments on guinea pigs, this is the first time I ever used AI to generate an image. Anyhow, it's to show that what's happening is STS is really proposing the southern tier as their guinea pig. To frack without water is still new and being done only in China. That they admittedly admit that CO2 is not currently cost competitive to fresh water for drilling, not to mention that existing CO2 supply from industrial sources or direct air capture is non-existent, as is the transport and storage infrastructure. The alum cycle gas plants are also new, and at present there's not a single plant operating in the US that both captures and disposes of their carbon emissions. They anticipate being among the first. And direct air capture is also fairly new, with only 17 operating plants. The risks, I think I've been through this. The one thing I haven't talked about is the opportunity risk, which is, investing these insane amounts of money and tax credits in these false solutions instead of in real ones is just unconscionable, but it's what we're doing. So yeah, my opinion, it's so wrong. It doesn't do anything to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels. It perpetuates it. Requires more and more land dedicated to drilling, production, processing, pipelines to procure and transport methane, more and more CO2 that must be piped and sequestered, hundreds of billions being spent on these false solutions. So does the New York law and regulations help us at all? Yeah, well, maybe. Our fracking ban right now, as it's written, only bans high volume hydraulic fracturing, defined as the stimulation of a well using more than 300,000 gallons of water as the fluid base. There's also a ban on, well, it's a moratorium on taking applications for gelled propane fracking. So, so the law doesn't really help us here, at this point, even though we have a fracking ban. The CLCPA maybe does, at least for part of this, because they talk in the CLCPA about carbon offsets, and that the department, meaning the DEC, has to verify that the greenhouse gas emission offset projects are authorized, that blah, 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 that the sequestration is real, additional, verifiable, enforceable, and permanent. They'll establish an application process that in a minimum requires a source to sufficiently demonstrate they're complying with the greenhouse gas limits, and that it's not technically feasible to do more, that they've reduced their emissions to the maximum extent possible. The law also says that sources in the electric generation sector shall not be eligible to participate in carbon offsets, including, and above in the definitions, carbon sequestration is one of the offset methods. There are, of course, exceptions, which is, if things are needed to ensure safety and reliability of the grid, they may end up making an exception. I don't know. I hope that some of these newer methods for addressing the long duration dispatchable needs will come to fruition, but this is certainly going to be in the mix. So the company talks about their Achilles heels of regulatory delays. Can they lease enough land? We know that the life cycle analysis, all of this stuff that would be coming out in an SGIS, a supplemental environmental impact study, just like we went through with fracking for years, which is frankly a waste of everybody's energy and time and effort. And hopefully we don't have to go that way. The DEC is geared up to do it if they need to. They haven't had a permit submitted yet, or an application permit to drill submitted yet to them, but they will go through the process that is required by law if they need to. But we can do something more. We can call Governor Hochul and tell her to ban fracking, and our heroic and and endlessly energetic Assemblywoman Dr. Anna Kellis is working on legislation to change the fracking ban to have broader language to apply to this as well. So stay tuned. And I think, you guys, I have finally reached the end. I'm going to stop sharing so I can see you and see the chat. And I thank, however many of you have stayed through all of this. I know it's a lot, and it is a lot. So.
So Irene, thanks so much for this really disturbing is the kindest word I can come up with right now. And very informative presentation. I had a long phone conversation with Anna the other evening. It was like a 40-minute conversation, and where she was looking at this whole situation, not in terms of what the national strategy is on the part of the fossil fuel industry. And she's going to talk more about this when she comes to TCCPI in January at our next meeting. But what she sees is that the fossil fuel industry has made a decision that they really don't have to do anything more in the red states in terms of securing support or minimizing opposition, that's locked in, and that what they are now turning to is really trying to find a place where they can chip away at the blue state wall, and that in doing so, they've really targeted New York State as the place to really focus their attention. That if they can minimize the impact of some of the new legislation that's been coming on board and will continue in terms of the CLCPA implementation, that they'll be able to create a template for which they can then do the same thing in other blue states. And I was thinking about that while you were walking us through the details of CO2 fracking, storage, transportation, the whole 9 yards. And it really seems like this is part of the process, that it's going to accomplish two things. One, it's going to try to persuade people they can have their cake and eat it too when it comes to fossil fuels, that somehow the whole process can be cleaned up. But second of all, now we're going to have to focus a lot of our attention on trying to stop this crazy scheme, and that's going to pull energy and time away from trying to implement legislation, a lot. I mean, all of which Anna supports, and some of which she's leading the charge on. The New York Heat Act, the Just Transition Act, the Stop Climate Polluter Handouts Act, which is an effort to at least end some of the fossil fuel subsidies in New York State. The effort to move on all these fronts, and those are just some of the positive legislation out there. The Climate Superfund Act is another one. That this is going to make it, it's going to spread out our need to allocate our time and energy in ways that are going to make it that much difficult to defeat the fossil fuel industry in New York. So it's all pretty enraging at least when I see it from that perspective. And as I said, Anna's going to talk more about what she sees as the really big picture here in terms of what fossil fuel strategy is as far as New York is concerned. But this seems to me to certainly be a very big piece of that.
Yeah, and just back to the first slide or second slide of my presentation, that maybe I should have used as a recap at the end as well, where I asserted that their proposal is an example of the nationwide feeding frenzy for federal tax credits and incentives that are designed to prop up the fossil fuel industry. It's a dangerous, destructive, unsustainable experiment consisting of a grab bag of costly false solutions that will perpetuate reliance on polluting fossil fuels while diverting investment and human resources. And Peter, that's exactly what I was thinking of, diverting investment and human resources from the real solutions we need for our energy transition.
Yeah, and as Joe points out in the chat, it also pulls away energy and resources from making sure that we elect people who are going to drive us in the right direction, or support the drive for us to go in the right direction. And I mean, we know, that the extent to which the fossil fuel industry can dominate the economic sectors, the extent to which it makes it that much harder to promote and sustain a small d democracy. And so, you know, this all fits together, at least in my head.
Yeah.
It's really something that we have to take very seriously and somehow find the energy and the time and the resources to defeat.
Yeah. And it's, you know, what's occurring to me is it's not just to ban the fracking in a way that is inclusive of this. Because one of the questions I've put to Tony, I haven't heard back, is, you know, the Utica shale, we know in this part of the state, that the gas has been already cooked out of it. There's no real gas to be had out of the Utica shale. But it's an enormous formation, and what I don't know is, do the pores still exist? And could they just, you know, inject into it to dispose of, you know, allegedly dispose of the CO2? And, you know, we have no idea if this, you know, so-called disposal really even lasts in perpetuity. And that's what we need, you know, and instead they want to use this to be able to keep on drilling and bring up more and more of their reserves and keep their, you know, stock prices afloat until, you know, for another 50 or 100 years. It's so scary. Just
But,
so
you know, of course, wind farms are so much more dangerous and
I know.
so much more disfiguring of the landscape, and they do things like cause cancer and spin off ice that could kill kids that are, you know, waiting at the bus stop. And you know, this just drives me crazy.
So you know, I'd love to take questions from people if you have them. And then
One of the questions was a map you showed earlier. This was very early on in chat.
yeah,
Whether it was just showing current pipelines or new ones. The blue
yeah, no,
line.
those are just existing pipelines. Yeah, those are just existing pipelines. So if there aren't questions, something that I genuinely would really like is, I kind of felt at a loss for adjectives to describe this, how shocking and stunning and appalling, and I don't quite have words. So frightening, yeah. So just throw into the chat your words for the oh my God impact that this has had, because I just don't have words big enough to capture how horrifying this is to me. So anybody that has words, throw them in the chat. It is diabolical, Sheila. Margaret, I see your comment. If I said that DEC is geared up to permit this, no. They, and I have as one of the slides, and I can send you the only statement from DEC is that they will do what they need to, you know, conduct a review if a permit is brought to them. A permit has not been brought to them. This guy, Bryce Phillips, did mention on a radio show on Capitol Press Room that they're hoping to do some test wells this spring or summer, and that he's begun conversations with the EPA. So I don't know, you know, enough about when it's EPA's jurisdiction over the wells and when it's DEC's. So I don't know. But I'm sorry if I misstated, DEC is not ready to permit this in any way. What they will do, if called upon, is do the kind of review that's required of any proposals that are put to them.
Brian, you have your hand up.
I'm
Are you on mute?
There I
There you
am. Yeah, it took me a second. Yeah, so I don't know, many of us were enthralled with Jacobson's papers of 6 or 8 years ago, you know, that we were going to have the ability to 100% wind, air, and solar. And all it took would be the big investors in energy to switch their investments from gas and oil to these things. And so everybody's been waiting for that to happen. And there has been some small investments, but you know, for PR purposes, but all of them are holding back. I don't know. I heard several stories lately about how much more that the oil and gas companies are investing in the exploration and development, and they're not going to change, because their view of this is that there's still a lot of appetite for their product, and that it's a much more you know, pays off much better than investing, even though wind and solar are being a positive flow, seeing a positive flow, not as much as oil and gas. So I put it at greed. You know, it's just not, they're not going to stop doing this until, and so this is why we have the reducing the subsidies and making them pay for the damages that they caused. They're running rampant across the universe here, and nobody's saying you need to pay for what you're doing. So
Well, there
anyway,
are proposals to do that, but guess what? They get enough tax credits and paybacks. I think that that's part of the deal. You know, here, we'll give you all these tax credits for you to do this stuff, because we're going to have to fine you in the future, and this way you'll get your money back. Honestly, I think that that's part of the scheme.
Yeah, and you know, and Brian and I have been talking about this and the way that the climate super fund and the effort to end state fossil fuel subsidies, or at least some of them, are really two sides of the same coin. Because
Yeah.
otherwise we're handing out subsidies and as you pointed out just now, Irene, tax credits to an industry that is causing terrible damage to not just New York State, but obviously the entire country, by pumping all of this CO2 and methane into the atmosphere, that's leading to the occurrence of these extreme weather events. And it's just, it's a Ponzi scheme, you know, and
our government's complicit. I mean,
oh God, yes.
That's the kicker.
Yeah, I mean, you know, just to bring it home a little bit, our governor, of course, is from Buffalo, and
Oh, I didn't say our governor. I said our government.
no, I know.
Yeah.
No, Irene, I'm just trying to make it a little bit more concrete than just
Okay.
government. Our governor is from Buffalo, and which is, of course, the National Gas is one of the big businesses that doesn't just dominate Buffalo, but Western New York, and the chief lobbyist for National Gas. This is something I was talking with Rich Schrader about. He's the chief policy person, advocacy person for NRDC. The chief lobbyist for National Gas is an old family friend of Hochul's. Their kids went to school together. They live in the same neighborhood.
Wow.
It's just, you know, this is one of the reasons why Rich and I also talked with Anna about this, think that the governor's really pulling back on the climate and energy transition stuff. That she feels like the only way she's going to get reelected is with the support, the money, to put a finer point on it, that she's going to get and is getting from the fossil fuel industry. And she's a Democrat, supposedly. It's almost like we'd be better off with a Republican governor, because at least, we know what we're dealing with. And the truth is that under Governor Pataki, there was a better chance to move forward in the way we need to, than with somebody like Hochul, who's just pretending to be somebody she isn't, and now the mask is coming off.
Yep. So I saw Amy had a question or a comment. Amy, yes, I somehow left it out of my presentation that yeah, there is now a move afoot to allow CO2 storage in our federal forests. Yeah, our forests.
Well, we certainly need people like Josh Riley in Congress, and fewer people than our current representative, who, of course, voted the other day to support the impeachment inquiry into Biden, which is just another distraction.
Yep.
Wayne, you have your hand up.
Great presentation, Irene. That's a lot of research and very well summarized. Lots of issues there. You talked a little bit about the offsite electrification of drilling and trucking operations and expressed some doubt. And so I did some math while you were just chatting. I've got the numbers on my desk for the electric consumption of the drill rig that was used to drill Kubo. And the biggest EV battery in production right now is installed in the Hummer, which is it's a 2,500 pound EV battery. And that Hummer battery at full charge would last 90 minutes on our drill rig if it was just at idle, not drilling. And at our peak electric draw on our drill rig, it would last 9 minutes.
Yeah.
So drilling on the kind of scale that we did on campus is we did drill electrically when we drilled Kubo, but we made a connection.
I didn't realize that.
Oh yeah, no, that was a deliberate decision that was made to reduce the emissions associated with drilling. We made a connection to our 13.2 kilovolt on-campus grid and ran the drill rig that way. But battery electrification of drilling operations is not feasible at this scale.
Yeah, and even or even the transport trucks. I presume they're big 18-wheelers.
That interestingly enough, transport
is that feasible at this point?
It is. It's not common in North America, but it's if you go to airports, for example, shipping ports. A lot of the heavy trucks that are running containers around there are electrified now. That's partially because they're interested in making that robotic. But as of today, the electric fleet doesn't exist in North America to electrify oil field operations.
Thanks, Wayne. That's really useful information.
It is. It's very interesting.
So there's a question, a request in chat from iPhone. I'm not sure who that is, but they're asking if you could say more about the map and disadvantaged communities that are shown, and the extent to which they'll be targets.
Yeah, I don't think that they would be targeted directly. In fact, our CLCPA requires exactly the opposite, that they be protected. And so it was more to show where things couldn't happen. But as I described about the carbon capture from industrial process sites, the capture is incomplete. So, I've been working with Karen to figure out where, STS talked about, 7 million odd metric tons of CO2 annually emitted within a 50-mile radius. So, we're working to identify where are the large emitters. And several of them are landfills. And anyhow, the problem is that when you do the CO2 capture, you're actually not capturing all of the CO2, and you're also not capturing some of the particulate matter and other of the smog and pollution causing problems. So to the extent that carbon capture is being used in disadvantaged communities, they will be impacted because things still aren't really getting cleaned up. They're just pretending to be cleaned up.
Guillermo, you have your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. As people have alluded to, a lot of this development is going on in rural communities, obviously, thousands or hundreds of acres of potentially farmland in a lot of cases, and whether it's solar or this or other things. So I'm curious, Irene, and sorry if I missed it, if anyone has any word or information on what they're offering to farmers or landowners in terms of lease agreements or even purchase.
I have some not detailed understanding. The thing that's really kind of blowing people's minds is they're offering $10 per lease for signing, not the thousands of dollars that was offered per acre in the days of fracking leases. So they're offering just $10 per lease, and with the promise that the farmers or landowners will make a lot of money when they start storing CO2 and recovering methane. That's where they'll make their real money. And there's some percentage that they're promising, that they'll make, but
There is, and it's based on the amount that they're able to sequester.
yeah, on the amount that they're able to sequester and on the amount that that they recover in methane. But
okay.
I haven't seen an actual lease. There's sort of an interesting legal thing, some of you may remember compulsory integration from fracking days. It's part of our law for removing resources from the ground, that the drilling chunk, I forget the formal word for it, that they want to drill in and recover from, has to be 60% of the landowners have agreed to allow this activity to happen on or under their property. The other 40% can be compulsorily integrated, even if they don't want the fracking to happen. They could be integrated and then would also be reimbursed for what gets removed. But what's interesting, from a legal standpoint, to me at least, is there's nothing that I'm aware of that allows you to inject and store something under somebody's property if they don't want it, especially if you're injecting and storing waste material. Or I don't know, I think in New York CO2 is not considered a hazardous waste. It ought to be, but anyhow, you know, so I don't know, and Margaret, if you're still on, take notes on that, because maybe that's another piece to deal with. And you know, that there can't be compulsory integration for
Yep.
For CO2 injection.
Taking lots of notes, Irene.
That's great. Thanks, Margaret. You know, back in the good old days of hydraulic fracking, very early on, we had somebody come through our neck of the woods, and they offered us $750 a year on our 11-acre farm, and I mean, you couldn't have offered us enough anyways, but $750, you know, to just absolutely take what we've got, this beautiful spot, and just desecrate it that way. I couldn't believe the nerve of them. You know, and my wife Rexy is from Nebraska, so she's been very focused on the Midwest and been very involved in the pipeline fights out there. And you know, this is going on out there as well, and they're talking about putting in a whole new network of pipelines to move CO2 around not just the Midwest, but you know, all down the Mississippi River Valley and all of that. And so, you know, this again is just a small, as awful and as huge and as octopus-like this seems, it's a really small piece of a much larger puzzle that's going on across the country.
Can I ask a question of somebody who's here? Can I do that, Peter?
Yeah, absolutely.
I see Carly Norton from NYSEG RG&E, and Carly, thank you for joining the presentation, and sorry to put you on the spot, but I'm wondering, you know, as I've, you know, reviewed this proposal, and I've wondered, I guess, a few things. My understanding is that there's not a lot of transmission lines, even for renewables, in the southern tier area. Have you gotten any contact or information from this company, or you probably can't answer that, but you know, what would your capacity be to support something like, you know, this kind of Allen plant build out, even if they only did 3 of them? You know, I mean, it's just astonishing. 300 megawatts each. Is there any kind of transmission capacity to manage that?
Well, thank you. I had a feeling it was going to be me that you were going to call on when you said that too, but no, thank you so much for the presentation. And to be totally honest with you, this is way more than I knew about this. I've just kind of seen the company's name pop up. And so I certainly haven't had any contact with them directly. I can't speak for our renewable side of the industry. So I really, quite frankly, this is more than I knew about them, you know, 2 hours ago. So I appreciate all the information. I can't really, unfortunately, speak to the capacity at this time, just because I'm not, you know, in tune with those conversations at the moment. But it's certainly really good context for me, and will inform, you know, my conversations that I have internally as well as with that group. You know, once I'm sure we will be having conversations at some point, it sounds like, but I haven't particularly had those yet. But this was very informative, and I appreciate all the time that you put into this presentation. And
Yeah.
you know, hopefully I have some information I can share with the group at another time. This is actually my first time joining this group, but I cover Tioga County out to Allegheny County. So this is certainly in my neck of the woods. My counterpart, Joe Russin, usually joins this group, and he covers, Broome, Cortland, that area, but this is actually more in my region than his, so I definitely appreciate all the information.
Yeah, there has been some mention from them about Schuyler County as well. So, we'll see. I guess.
Irene, one of the things I know about is from my involvement in, I haven't recently, but a few years ago, I was very involved in helping out the Canastillo wind farm project, and that's stalled out. And one of the reasons why it's stalled out is because of the transmission issues. There just isn't enough capacity on the transmission line out there to support the Canastillo project, and so it's going to involve building a new transmission line that's going to, these things cost $1 million a mile, so it's a big deal.
Yeah,
I think you're absolutely right that the transmission issues are huge, and as far as this kind of project is concerned.
Yeah,
and I guess I generally can speak a little to that, just broadly speaking, our investments that we have planned just for the existing, projects, we have huge goals, obviously, or we have huge projects in the works to meet the CLCPA goals as it is with, the turbines that exist already. So yeah, I mean, generally speaking, we're the transmission, certainly capacity is definitely an issue that, we're working on every day already.
Yeah. Yeah, I would hate to see these projects interfere with our ability to build out the renewables.